I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 151. And today it is Terri's turn to share something that she's found interesting this week. Terri, what have you got for us?
Well, Daisy, I went back to one of my favorites, Being Well with Rick and Forrest Hanson.
I haven't heard from them for a while.
Yeah. This topic, I think, is one that probably most of us struggle with at some level. And so one that I found useful for me to think about and hopefully for our listeners. It's episode 236. Responding to criticism and accepting the way things are. So as I started listening to this, one of the first distinctions that I made from what they were talking about is the difference between criticism and complaints. So I remember when I was a therapist, helping people to make that distinction of being criticized or hearing a complaint, or expressing criticism versus expressing a complaint. And the way I make this distinction is that criticism is usually saying that whatever is happening is wrong, or that the person is wrong or bad or flawed or whatever the criticism is. Whereas the complaint is more focused on what I'm experiencing with it. So rather than saying, you're a horrible listener, you don't even pay attention to what I say, that's criticism, to say, I don't feel like you hear me when I talk to you. That's a complaint.
Oh, interesting, because I thought it was kind of going to be the other way around. I was sort of thinking of constructive criticism and how we need to be able to take constructive criticism.
In this episode, I'm trying to think, I don't know that they made a distinction. I think they talked about criticism and complaints similarly. But the way Forrest, the younger one of the two, the son, the way he started the episode is he started reading some feedback about their podcast. And they were people saying things like, Forrest has the most annoying back of his throat laughter. It would be so much better if he just wouldn't do that. And I just started to laugh because, every once in a while you and I look at feedback from our podcast or other podcasts. And I think for many of us, that is hard to hear, that criticism. And I remember, I think I shared this with you, the first podcast I ever did was not one that you edited. And after it was published, person gave the feedback, wrote to me, emailed me, and said, oh, that podcast was great. However, you say far too often. And I just felt so deflated, like, oh man, this is why I didn't want to do any, kind of public speaking on these topics. I was so concerned about that anyway. Well, by the end of this complaint, the person said, the good news is that I'm a vocal coach and I can coach this out of you. So let me know if you want to work together.
Ka-ching.
Yeah. So that reminded me to pay attention to what does the information mean for that person. This person had a vested interest in giving me that critical feedback or constructive feedback or however you want to frame it. But Forrest then talked about that generally complaints fall into one of two categories. They're either constructive, meaning something that someone can generally do something about. So by bringing it up, you're actually hoping to improve the situation.
Right, yeah.
Or expressive complaints. And expressive complaints are more just what they sound like, expressing your feelings.
That's just having a vent and a whine about something.
And relatively, there's little chance that someone can do something about it. And they're really not geared toward problem solving. Like you said, it's more of a rant or just, I want to complain. I think it's important then to kind of think about this. Sometimes we might get caught up in a pattern of complaining, and we're not actually complaining to try to improve or fix anything. We just are complaining about our circumstance. And he used this phrase that I really liked here. And unfortunately, it was one that, when you hear it, and you and I have talked about this, about other things, but when you hear it, you're like, Oh, shoot. That describes me. He called it that sometimes we fall into a mood of complaint. And he said basically you can be in a stance of nothing being the way you want it to be. So much of this mood of complaint is about wanting things to be different from how they actually are. And so instead of finding ourselves in that place, that we could maybe work on broadening our window of acceptance. And as I said, this crushed me just a little bit when I heard it, because I know sometimes, especially in significant relationships, I think I communicate from a mood of complaint. I'm just complaining about this isn't the way I want it, and this should be like this, and this isn't good enough, and it sets up such...
Yeah, I want it to be a different way.
Yeah.
So I'm going to complain about the fact that it's not the way I want it to be.
Yeah. And if you really think about it, it's like I'm miserable, and I'm just making sure everyone else is miserable, and it's just hearing all of my complaints. And so, as I said when I started this one, this made me really think about, because this is not something that I really appreciate about my approach, and it's something I want to continue working on. I don't want to be caught in this mood of complaint. I think it's valid to have complaints, especially when they are complaints that are geared toward improving something.
Yes, that's the crux of it, isn't it? There needs to be a point. There needs to be... It's difficult because I can think of so many things that I just want to have a rant about. I want to have a rant about Southern Water dumping their sewage in the sea. Mm-hmm. But when you're ranting that it's a complaint that's not going to get you anywhere. Mm-hmm. And it just makes you not feel good.
And that's the part that I think is so important about this. And I believe in my life, I've worked on this a lot over the past few years, but I still catch myself sliding back into that. And they talked about it, that such a huge part of our overall experience in life is boiled down to what we are paying attention to.
Yeah.
And when I'm stuck more in that mood of complaint, I'm paying attention to what's not going well.
Yeah.
What's not the way I want it to be. And it's almost like just a bias that I'm looking at everything as what's wrong with it?
Yeah.
How could it be better? Why don't I like it?
Yeah, it's the opposite, isn't it, of what we've talked about when you, going back to our very first episode, talking about gratitude journaling. And I knew I was getting a bit into that negative, critical headspace. And it does taint the way you're looking at things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you're big on the energy you put out.
I am.
And what you receive as well. So it's a cycle that you can get into.
Absolutely. And I still get wrapped up in it sometimes. So I think it's a great thing for most of us to be thinking about looking at.
It's hard not to, though. It's part of being human, isn't it?
So one of the things they then talked about is, how do we hear complaints better? How can we accept people's complaints and learn from them or take them in without throwing us off? And one of the things they talked about, it can be really helpful to think about is, and this is hard for many of us, but leaning into the complaint a little bit, leaning in to understand what they mean, what's important. So you might ask the person, what's important to you about this? Why does this bother you? Now, I can imagine if I said, why does this bother you? I'm using a harsh tone like, get off my back, Jack. Why does this bother you? But if instead to say, what about this bothers you? Because then we can get at the meaning, what's happening, and maybe even to ask somebody, what would it look like if this were better? When we understand then what it is that they're expressing or what they want or need, it's so much easier to respond well to it. And sometimes we can even recognize that their complaint really isn't about us. It's about their experience of something. Maybe we can help improve their experience of it, and maybe we can't. So sometimes their complaints are things that we can work on, and sometimes we just have to accept that that's their stuff. And I think this is complicated. One of the things that Forrest said that I really liked, he said, in reality, most complaints have an emotional basis. It may sound like a desire to be seen or met in some way. And if we can hear that, so again, going back to that question, what does this mean to you? So let's say someone says, I hate when you leave the cupboard doors open. Rather than saying, why does it bother you? Who cares? Instead to say, what about that bothers you? And if they say, well, I feel like if you don't care about this and you know that I like things to be neat, I feel like you just don't really care about me then. Oh.
So much more than the cupboard door.
Yeah. Now I can work on communicating that connection or that value. And, if you really go back to this, it's not so much just about the cupboard doors. It's about how they're feeling valued. And I think it gives us a lot more space to work on some of these things. Instead, I could just be irritated. Why is that such a big deal? Who cares? It's just cupboard doors. We're the only people here. But if it means to that person, I'm not valuing our space enough, it's hurting them. It means something more significant. They also talked then about how can we work on accepting complaints? And one suggestion was to work towards separating out a little bit from the complaint and listening for, what does this mean? What role do I play in it? Versus taking it as I'm being criticized. I certainly, most often, when someone expresses a complaint, my first reaction is to feel criticized.
Get defensive.
Being told somehow I'm incompetent or not doing something right. And again, that's often not what the complaint means. There's an unmet need or a meaning that is being made on the other part, that if I understood that, I could accept this complaint much differently.
As I like what you said at the beginning, when I said it sort of went a different way from the way I thought, the differentiation you made between criticism and complaint. Criticism sounded much more like it was a criticism of the person, where the complaint was more a complaint about an action. A complaint was about something that somebody had done. So it's this whole splitting your actions away from who you are, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And if you can separate that, it makes it easier to hear a complaint.
Absolutely. They then talked some about how could we do better at giving complaints? Because sometimes we do need to give feedback, and we have some complaints that are really valid and we want to express them, but we're probably pretty sure they're not going to be received really well. So, how can we work on that part of this exchange? And talked about the idea that first you can work on, I don't remember what term they used, but I might use the term joining. You can kind of join the person. And I know sometimes when I get this feedback, I hear the but coming in this sentence, but it's kind of like, hey, babe, I really appreciate that you've been doing this lately. That has really been helpful. And then there's this slight pause. And it would mean a lot to me if you could do this part of it, because, so if you're going to express a complaint, it's almost like make a connection with the person first so that it can help it from being felt as much like a criticism. And then the other piece of this is to, again, kind of go into a complaint is telling you my experience, not telling you who you are or what about you is bad. And at one point in the episode, they gave an example of I think it was a class, and people had to give a presentation or something. And then they had to get feedback. And unfortunately, when the person finished the presentation and then the people gave feedback, they said, oh, well, you shouldn't do this, and you should never start an intro like this, and you shouldn't do this, and you should always do this. So it felt very critical. And the instructor stopped and said, no, this isn't what I mean. We're going to try this a different way. How did you feel when you listened to this presentation? Then the feedback came back very differently. Someone might say, I felt really connected to you when you got started. And when you went through this example, I felt like I could really understand you. And I even felt kind of heard because it sounded like you understood some things I've struggled with. And when you went off and talked about this, I started to feel bored. And I recognized that I wasn't listening as carefully. And then I had a harder time following your content.
Interesting.
We are experts on our experience. So that's the best feedback to give. That person got the necessary feedback. You lost me here. When you started going down this path and you didn't do this or whatever, I got disconnected and you lost me. Better than saying, you're not really a good speaker because about halfway through, I couldn't even pay attention to you anymore. So, one way to help us in giving complaints or sharing complaints is to work on focusing them on our experience.
It also helps the person who's, whatever you would call it, the complainee. No, not the complainee, the complainant. the person who's receiving the complaints. Because hearing it from that perspective, one person could say what you just said, but then somebody else wouldn't have been bored with that content. And so if you're getting this feedback, presumably in this example that you gave, as being helpful for the next presentation they're giving, well, if 9 out of 10 people give the feedback that they didn't get bored, well, on balance, you probably wouldn't change the way you delivered that presentation because of the one person. But it's so easy to listen and to put too much onus on that one negative criticism, or you take it as being negative. But if you get that perspective, again, it comes down to context, but the balance of how important is it that one person went that way, but it was just one person out of the 10 people. So on balance, it doesn't actually really, matter so much. It's not going to affect too much how I change my presentation the next time. Whereas if 9 out of 10 people said that and one person said, oh, it was fine. No, I didn't get bored. It's a really interesting way of hearing the complaints.
And I think you really highlighted an important piece here is if I'm getting feedback from 10 people and only one person thought that part got really boring, it probably is safe to say that was something more specific about that person. Certain stressors going on in their life that they couldn't stay attentive during that part of the presentation, or maybe I'm giving, let's say, for example, I'm giving an accounting presentation and everyone else has taken Accounting 101 and that person hasn't. I don't have to take that feedback as being detrimental, like you said, because overall the feedback is that part didn't get boring or I didn't disconnect. The flip side of this point that you just made that I think is really important is, again, it tells us or reminds us it's what we're choosing to pay attention to.
Yeah.
If I leave that class and think my presentation was horrible because one person told me they got disconnected and couldn't follow me once I got to a certain point, I'm going to over self-judge and I'm going to over criticize the presentation and, maybe take on a negative evaluation of the whole thing. Versus if I listen to the overall feedback. And you and I know this about podcasts. You can get 1,000 positive comments. But if what you're paying attention to is the person that says Forrest has a really gravelly back of his throat laugh that is annoying, you're going to maybe become overly sensitive to that or overly critical of what you're doing versus, oh my gosh, we've gotten 20,000 pieces of feedback and 2 of them focused on this.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think it's also interesting to think about the value of complaining. If you're wanting to complain about something, and maybe I'm sort of thinking of myself here and how, well, you just want to complain about something because you just want to rant about it. Is there a possibility of change with this complaint? Am I making a complaint to A company that sent something with a faulty good or something, is there a point in complaining? Am I going to get something from this complaint? And how then can I best structure it to get the outcome that I want from it? And that potentially they can benefit from that feedback as well. Yeah, it's something you said earlier about people who ask the kind of questions when you complain. There's a massive difference with the company that says, how can we make this right?
Mm-hmm.
They throw it back to you. We've heard your complaint. We're really sorry that's happened. How can we make it right? Because actually, when it gets thrown back to you to ask for whatever you want, you usually scale it back and, actually, was it so bad? Or maybe actually it's okay. Or you could, send this or that. But automatically, it seems it just deflates the situation a bit because they're listening to me.
Yeah.
They've heard my complaint, and that is a big part of it, that you just want somebody to sound like they've heard you.
Mm-hmm. And the distinction he pointed out between the constructive complaints and the expressive complaints, I still don't think that means we should never share an expressive complaint, even though there's probably not much change that's going to come from it. Because sometimes even having our feelings heard, validated, helps us to lighten them or feel better about them. So in your example, if I tell you, oh, I really didn't like the way this happened, that didn't feel good to me, and you say, oh, Terri, what could I do in the future to not have it feel that way? I might even say, actually, I don't think there's anything you need to change. I just needed you to know that didn't feel good.
Mm.
That can be reparative and helpful in and of itself. So I want to be clear that in talking about this, I don't think they implied this, and I don't think I wouldn't want anyone walking away from it, that if it's an expressive complaint, you just shouldn't share it. You should just keep it to yourself. You and I like to vent sometimes, and sometimes that's helpful. And sometimes it's helpful to hear someone else say, oh yeah, I get it. That would bother me too. And again, we just don't want to stay stuck with that too long, because then I know for me, I then fall into that mood of complaint. Well, let me tell you one more thing that bothers me, Daisy. Oh yeah? Well, let me tell you another thing that in this world that is wrong.
So that's when you need to get into, what did you call it at the beginning? Working on broadening your acceptance level. What was
Which I think is a really important concept of not everything is going to please me. Not everything is going to be great. And I don't even mean, sometimes I dislike saying things like acceptance of the way things are, because if someone's in an abusive relationship, I don't want to encourage them to accept the way things are.
No.
If someone's being physically abused, I don't want them to just accept the way things are. So I always get a little hesitant on those things. But the idea of, in a broader sense, I don't love the way this certain aspect turns out a lot of the times, but it kind of is the reality in life, and I'm okay with that. So broadening our level of acceptance of things as they are.
Yes, just sometimes makes your own life easier and happier is basically the outcome there. Sometimes just, upping the acceptance level just means, you let a few more things go, and you're not getting niggled and annoyed and feeling in that sort of nasty, irritated place. It's not pleasant to feel like that, is it?
I can think of a quick example for me of that, and I've shared this in other places before, but I like to use the self-checkout at grocery stores. And it often seems like I get kind of caught up behind someone who's never used it before and has too many items, and every item that they try to scan doesn't work. And then they, text a message on their phone. So I'm still standing there waiting. And it's so easy for me to just get really annoyed with that. And that's a great example for me to start accepting it as it is. Well, Terri, you're standing in the self-checkout. People are going to take their time and do what they need to do. This is going to take a little longer than you hoped. It's okay. And then I don't leave there annoyed. Because what would happen in the past is I'd leave, and then the next person I saw, like, you won't believe this person at the line in front of me. He sent 2 texts while I was waiting. Can you believe? But if I work on accepting it more, I don't spend all of that energy on getting so amped up about it.
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually, because that's one I've worked on. Every time, I take my own shopping bags. I think everyone does that these days, everywhere. Is it the norm in the States? Or
it is for a lot of people. In California, if you don't bring a bag, you get charged for your bag.
Right, yeah. And that's the way here. And it was before that in France. So I got really used to doing it in France. But I have, these sort of hefty, nice canvas sort of bags for life kind of thing that really are bags for life. They last forever, but they're heavy. So when you put them on the self-checkout, it says, have you got your own bags? You put your bags first before you start scanning stuff. But because they're heavier than a plastic bag, you have to wait for the assistant to come over and to put their key fob on it and thing and say that it's okay. She hasn't actually put a bag of, she hasn't put products there. It's just a heavy bag. And it's just like every time. And then, you have to wait because there are others. But yeah, you just learn to let it go. Mm-hmm. And I would have been that person because for some reason, something weird went on with my card and I had to, all my shopping was done and I went to pay on the self-checkout and I had to get on the phone and clear with my bank before they would free up my card again. So yes, I was that person.
But what a great example.
There was nothing I could do.
But what a great example. I don't know that context. And instead, I'm letting myself get annoyed.
Yeah.
Because my interpretation is, how selfish of her to get on her phone right now while I'm still waiting, versus she must need something right now. I'm just going to wait. So that acceptance of things as they are, like I said, I don't mean that in abusive situations or neglectful situations, but I do think that's an important one. And I think it's one that if I keep working on that, it helps me have fewer complaints.
Yeah. Yeah. And just weed out and just make the meaningful complaints that will actually get you a good result.
Absolutely.
Hopefully.
So there we have it. A little bit of insights into how to give and to receive complaints without letting them cause so much difficulty. And you and I both have explored how to be more patient in the checkout aisle at the store. So I hope everyone has been able to take some thoughts from today and apply these into their own lives.
Well, it's definitely given me some things to think about because, yes, I am one who has a bit of a tendency to stew on things a little bit.
So to work on not being in the mood of complaint.
Yes, definitely.
Very good.
Well, until next time, I hope you have a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everybody.